We also asked about industry. When I talk about industry, I talk about the established industry sector, the established players, the established associations, the research institutes, etc., that characterise an established industry. We had two views about that. The first view was actually we cannot get any traction with our local industry base, or the second view is, yeah, it was helpful. So the first view is more about, okay, so if you are doing starting in a disruptive business technology or a disruptive business, of course, the established industry sector struggles to identify with you. Because, oh, hang on a minute, you're disrupting what we do. So that makes it difficult for a startup to actually draw support from an established industry sector. On the other hand, if you're actually starting a venture which has relevance and to an industry sector, certainly you can actually find some support there. Mostly through ideas and learning and knowledge about the industry sector. When it comes to the startup itself, industry sectors weren't much use. So you can't look to an established industry sector and say, help me with startup, not interested. So that's generally the message we got there. Importantly though, entrepreneurs overwhelmingly are looking for a community to work with. And the whole idea of an entrepreneurial ecosystem and the support structures that go around that creates this community. The other important thing is if entrepreneurs were starting a company which couldn't find a place, we also observed that they would go out and start their own community. So, which is a really interesting outcome to be aware of, that they are very much self-resourcing. That's what entrepreneurs do. I want to go to, what we actually did is went through a series of steps then and asked them, what happens at the startup? When you wake up one day and you say, I've got a really good business idea, who do you turn to for support? We then said, okay, so once you've got past that stage and you move into trying to survive, you've got your business up and running and you're trying to survive, who do you turn to for support? Where do you draw support from? Similarly, once you get into the growth stage, who do you turn to? And lastly, when you want to exit the business, who do you turn to for support? Where do you look for support? I want to put this up as the overall summary, if you like, of what was going on here. Notice that there's a lot of the categories down the bottom here are all falling away from left to right. That's probably not surprising. When you're actually starting up, you're looking for support. When you get to the exit stage, you've made it. You don't need that support any longer. So the really interesting things are actually 4 things on this graph. There are 2 that actually were different in trend. That's this one here, which is the investors. Oddly enough, from left to right, it's rising. So as you actually work through starting your venture, you are looking for more capital, more support in your funding. The other interesting one was this one, the advisory services. What we found across the board was that there was always a seeking to, how do we get support in an advisory sense? Now that includes your mentors, etc. as well. So left to right, always looking for better advice, better information about what we do and how we do. 2 other interesting things in the dotted lines here. One is this one. This is the networking and startup events. Notice this peak here. It falls away left to right, but notice the peak here at growth. To this side, at growth here. Interesting, this was about network and startup events. What we actually observe here is when people are actually going through their growth phase, they're also looking for contacts. So these networking events have a different purpose, and not only the one we think about in terms of startup, but it is about making connections also for growth, whether that be suppliers, employers, market opportunities, etc., new customers. That's the kind of thing that really starts to spike here in terms of the growth phase. The other one I want to point you to, and this relates to the valley of death kind of thing that we're talking to here, this is government support, this one. It peaks here at survival, which really goes to the case. It's really when you actually have something that looks like it might survive, you're not going to get the support from the investors, although you might be looking for it. You're more likely to seek or be looking for support from the government sector to help you through that sort of phase of transitioning that valley of death. So some interesting things there. I want to quickly go through each of the stages now and each of the particular findings on each of the categories. And that should take at least 3 hours. No, I'll cut it down very quickly. And on the startup, 3 things come out. 2 major things: advisory services and the network and startup events. Probably not surprising. Does my idea have credence and credibility? That's what they're trying to check at the startup, through the startup events. Advisory services, what do I actually need to get started? And particularly what came through here is the low or no cost advisory services, which are particularly important for people at this stage. It doesn't stay that way, I might note. As they actually go through, we found more and more prepared to pay for it once I get to growth and exit side of things, because now I can. But at this stage, it's really that low cost and no cost. So they're the 2 primary things that are happening here at the startup. All these other things, important to some extent. Now, I wouldn't want to downplay their importance, but in terms of finding support, these 2 were the 2 that actually came to the fore. If I just go on now to the survival stage, what you see here is that, again, the advisory services and network and startup events are still important. Investors start to kick into now. I'm actually got a product, I'm trying to survive. So I'm looking for that support now in terms of money. And this is where the organic growth concepts really come in. If I can't source it outwardly, I've got to find it inwardly. Either that's through keeping our cost structure down or acquiring new customers or working my network to try and find other types of support. The other thing I would point to is, whilst these other areas, education and incubators and co-working spaces, they were reducing at this point, but I wouldn't suggest for a moment that they're less important, because what happens here is they've actually already established that connection now. So at the survival stage, they've got that, take it away and they could fall over, so we don't need to get rid of it, but in terms of now, there's some other things which are taking the priority. Growth, again, advisory, investment and networking. 3 major ones. These things are now starting to fade away, as you would expect. Exit. Advisory services here. There's a big kind of gap here in terms of how do we exit. And clearly there was a lot to take on board in terms of mentors in this as well. The mentors and the relationships that were started right back at the startup actually thread right through this as well. So you become part of that community. You're getting support and seeking assistance from that community. Just quickly, barriers and drivers. All this is available in the report, by the way. So barriers and drivers, dark side for barriers, light side for drivers. What I tried to do here, or what we tried to do here, is give you some contrast. So while we've got these negative things, there are some positive things that are actually offsetting it. So there's some things to think about there in terms of contrast, and I won't spend any time on it tonight. I do want to talk about the subgroup analysis. We did actually look at immigrants, women and youth as particular subgroups to say, were there special requirements for these? There was a 4th group, which was really to take into account the geographic spread. What we found in Adelaide, that geographic spread didn't really matter, because we weren't actually finding much residence of people outside of city metropolitan. They were happy to come here. So that 4th one fell away for us. But this is a little interesting characteristic here. If I just take the women's subgroup first of all, you can see some different characteristics here in terms of networking. For me, and that comes through again here in the co-working spaces, you kind of see that the women, as an entrepreneur, tended to focus a little bit more on the networking activities to actually get through. And this was not only come through this commentary, but also in the conversations with women through the group, there was at least one comment I remember that, but women are better at this anyway. And maybe that's true. So there's something interesting there. Youth is interesting as well, to see youth, and I must say the youth group, we could only get 3 participants. So that really became problematic. So this may not be as telling as or general response as some of the others. But really interesting here is that in some of these categories they didn't recognise an area at all of assistance. A lot of the focus here was on money. So what that really says, in my view, is that as a young entrepreneur, what we're really looking to do is try and support them with some fairly wise heads, so as they can navigate through what they actually need. Because I think the experience base, it just blinds them a little about what's required. And I think that comes through this report. The last one was the immigrant groups. Immigrant groups, which were this one here, mostly looked for advisory services, were basically oblivious to everything else that was there. This is a real opportunity, I think, for South Australia to see what we can do with immigrants that are coming in who are highly skilled business people, but really don't have the access to the networks and are not familiar with the business communities here. I've realised after we've done this, I've probably mislabelled that. The centre of this circle, it really should be about career awareness. Interesting thing, I'll go back just quickly. This is really disheartening. Formal education, which is this little line that's flipping along the bottom here. As an educator, I nearly cut my wrists and I thought, no, I won't do it. But interestingly, as we spoke to people about what the formal education thing, it wasn't that formal education was not important. They deemed it as important, but not while I'm trying to get my venture up and going. It's too expensive, both in time and dollars. So once they've started, it's really hard to actually draw from that service. This is all about career awareness and preparing people for the journey. What I'm trying to depict here is, if we think about our entrepreneurial ecosystem, if we understand, if we make people aware of entrepreneurship as a career, then we need to actually open up the network events for them. This is what provides them the channels to the services on the outside. So it's really through that networking events that it actually opens up the opportunities for where do I get support, how do I move forward. So awareness is a key thing, networks is the next key thing, and that opens channels to those other things. We've developed a series of 9 interventions to think about. These are not necessarily, I'm not prescribing these, but I'm suggesting them as possible things we might want to think about. And Gavin mentioned earlier, the event we'll have end of September, October, around the entrepreneurial ecosystem. What I think we might be able to make some of these a discussion point and see whether there is a way to strengthen some interventions to actually to strengthen our ecosystem. Specific recommendations? I would suggest the one thing that was missing off our map is these entrepreneurial career awareness programs. Maybe that's something we should be looking at. Where are these? How many of them? Where are they? And who's experiencing them? It would be a good thing to actually get a sense of. Examine the 9 suggested interventions. Let's have a look at those and see whether there's something we can actually take forward with that. And as I say, I don't prescribe them, but I think the ecosystem itself should engage with some of these questions and determine whether we've got something to offer. Consider for special and immediate attention. I would really think about the higher cost startups, the level of complex businesses, the manufacturing sectors, the ones that engage with more complex supply chains. How do we get those businesses going? I think there's some real interesting work to do there, and particularly with getting some access to low-cost seed funds for those type of ventures. I think that's an important thing for us to consider. A red carpet service for our immigrants. They actually may be able to provide some of that insight into our complex industries. Increased collaboration and cooperation. This is a nice statement. It's something we all have responsibility for. How do we actually work together? And reflecting on the words of Gavin at the outset, working together to collaborate as private sector, university sector, and what have I missed? Government sector, of course. How do we actually all work together to actually create a stronger ecosystem? I've got to put a plug in for this one. Develop an entrepreneurial ecosystem measurement methodology. That's my last suggestion. Final remarks, the full resources of our South Australia ecosystem could be more effective to leverage our entrepreneurial opportunities, and we've got opportunities to actually improve that. Given the pace of change in South Australia, this is not an option. I think it's an imperative for us to start to actually do something. The concluding step of this current research will be to build some case studies, which I mentioned before. So some of you that I know are here tonight, we would be in touch with you soon to actually get those case studies developed. thank you. You can find the report at our blog, and I just checked it a moment ago. It is up and running, so you can actually download it free from there. It is available. And similarly, our books are for sale at the front here, so if you've got time between drinks to actually come and visit our desk and actually purchase a book, that'd be wonderful. And you can also download them free as well, which I've given you some information on that if you want to read it only as an ebook. So they're your options. So with that, thank you all for attending. Should we do questions? I didn't think about questions. No burning questions? If they are, you need to quench them, I think,
That brings our formal proceedings to an end, and as Allan mentioned, there's some drinks outside. We'd love you to stay around, and if you do have any burning questions, perhaps of any of the speakers, perhaps you could ask them outside over a drink. But thank you very much for coming along tonight. Very much appreciated.